In this fourth episode, deconstructing Jordan Peterson's biblical series, I look at an extremely baffling oversight given his repeated claims the Judeo-Christian ethic is the foundation of Western civilization. As the book of Deuteronomy is central to that value system, it is very strange that he fails to make any statement on the importance of Deuteronomy in any of his lectures. Peterson only gives Deuteronomy a passing mention in reference to the source material for the Bible in his first episode. The final one is the Deuteronomist Code. It contains the bulk of the law. Why Deuteronomy was so important deserves its own explanation, and the documentary, The Bible Unearthed, explains it in excellent detail.
Deuteronomy was hugely important for Western civilization, because for the first time, the individual was singled out from the crowd as the focus of moral responsibility and duties. Baruch Halpern believes this was actually connected to the earlier Assyrian attacks on Judah.
Many elements of the reform actually precede the reform. They're the result of the exile of the rural population of Judah in 701 BC by the Assyrian king Sennacherib. The extended family essentially disappears from the landscape of Judah in the 7th century after 701 BC. We no longer have compounds housing extended families. We have individual houses. We no longer have collective tombs containing hundreds of people being buried together. We no longer have large cooking pots. We no longer have large ovens. All these things shrink down in size, as they do in other cultures when the extended family disappears and the nuclear family becomes the center of organization and identity. Effectively, what you see in the 7th century BC is the development of individuality.
These social changes were reflected in radical new laws in Deuteronomy. An ideological change of great enduring consequence.
There's something else about Deuteronomy which is remarkable, and this is what we can call today the ideas of civil rights, of rights of the individual, of the person. I mean, Deuteronomy is full of ideas how to protect women, children, slaves, people who lose their land, the simple people. It was probably one of the ways to attempt to mobilize the people of Judah behind the ideas of the new reforms, because they give them, the rights, if you wish, for the first time.
This pottery fragment from Josiah's time records a petition from an unknown agricultural laborer against his local commander.
What it testifies to is a new consciousness at the end of the 7th century, in the time of King Josiah, even among simple agricultural workers, that the power of the governor was subject to some greater laws, some greater morality. And it's here on this broken piece of pottery, as archaeological evidence from the time of Josiah, that what we now still believe as biblical tradition and biblical morality was born among the people in the fields of ancient Judah at the end of the 7th century BC.
What you have here is a case of the rejection of tradition. It's not the invention of tradition, it is the rejection of tradition. And that is the mindset, the self-conscious mindset on which science and monotheism and Western civilization have been founded.
Considering that the transmission of rights and responsibilities was imparted to Western civilization through Deuteronomy, as the Bible Unearthed clip demonstrates, this factual point would actually strengthen his case. Yet, as he has done several other times, he fails to point his audience to the origin of this precious Judeo-Christian ethic, an ethic which he fears is being lost due to secularization, and will doom us all to a nihilistic dystopia if we forget.
If you look at the way that the idea of the individual sovereignty developed, it's clear that it unfolded over thousands and perhaps 10,000s of years before it became something firmly fixed in the imagination that each individual had something of transcendent value about them. And man, I tell you, we dispense with that idea at our serious peril.
Here and in the next two videos, I will present Peterson's numerous references of exaggerated claims that secularism, or its more panic-inducing cousin, atheism, are threats to a human ethic as, apparently from his perspective, the adamant anti-religious thinkers are dispensing with that idea, that each individual had something of transcendent value. Freud might once again wonder why Peterson makes such absurd claims about what secular or atheist people are trying to do. Inherent in his ridiculous claims is also the fact that he is completely ignoring the humanist values of equal rights that atheists support for all people irrespective of religion, gender, or sexual identity. He also conveniently omits to mention that it is most often people of religious faith attempting to deny these same rights because of their scriptures. Once again, his pattern of behavior reveals his true motivations. As Peterson points out that core values unfolded over thousands and perhaps tens of thousands of years, emerging into consciousness as the collective way for civilizations to act, then obviously the claims of biblical ethics are unfounded. Also, as noted in the Bible Unearthed clip, we can see that the idea of individual sovereignty in Judah was formulated by a group of henotheistic field workers in the era before the monotheistic reforms of Judaism. Inquiring minds then might wonder why we need biblical values at all, if, as Peterson clearly points out, the values emerge entirely separately from religion thousands of years before the reforms which are at the very core of the Judeo-Christian ethic in Deuteronomy. This is clearly a non sequitur that religious ethics are the key to civilized society, and a logical fallacy that he is either entirely blind to or has made the conscious choice to ignore as inconvenient to his premise. This is aside from the fact that Deuteronomy did help to codify and transmit the ideas of human rights, which does contribute to his argument for a Judeo-Christian ethic and Western society. But that is surprisingly not the argument he made. Further, in the case of Judaism, the values of individual rights were codified into the state religion as a tool of political convenience during the reforms of King Josiah in the 7th century BCE. Therefore, religion was a tool of the reforms and not the initiator of the value system, as noted. But for Peterson, it is the central premise of his entire series that the Judeo-Christian ethic is the very cornerstone of Western society, so it is very strange that he does not acknowledge the role Deuteronomy played. Though perhaps it is the very inconvenient truth that our humanist values preceded their codification in Deuteronomy and the social and political context of their inclusion, which prompted him to skip over the significance of this book to avoid going into precisely this contextual basis. There is that pesky Freud popping up again. What's up with your calculated omissions, Jordan? Peterson does talk about individual sovereignty, a concept included in Deuteronomy, but once again, his Christian bias leads him to make multiple errors in his claims of trying to stress the importance of God and religion and completely overlooking the negative aspects of Christian history.
But the Christian response to that was never confuse the specific sovereign with the principle of sovereignty itself. It's brilliant. You see how difficult it is to come up with an idea like that, so that even the person who has the power is actually subordinate to something else, subordinate to, let's call it a divine principle, for lack of a better word. So that even the king himself is subordinate to the principle. And we still believe that because we believe that our president, our prime minister, is subordinate to the damn law, whatever the body of law, right? There's a principle inside that even the leader is subordinate to. And without that, you could argue you can't even have a civilized society because your leader immediately turns into something that's transcendent and all-powerful. And I mean, that's certainly what happened in the Soviet Union and what happened in Maoist China and what happened in Nazi Germany, because there was nothing for the powerful to subordinate themselves to. You're supposed to be subordinate to God. So what does that mean? Well, we're going to tear that idea apart, but partly what it means is that you're subordinate, even if you're sovereign, to the principle of sovereignty itself. If you confuse the notion of sovereignty with the current sovereign, then your culture immediately degenerated into a totalitarian state and turned to stone, and that was deadly. Then you were slaves. And then the thing was going to collapse as well. Like, no matter how big and grandiose, as soon as the ruler became the concrete incarnation of the ideal, there was no distinction between the man and the divine notion of the ideal, then the society was doomed. And I think that that's I think that's true. It's as simple as that. And I think we saw more than enough evidence of that in the 20th century, and we're certainly seeing the same thing repeating itself now.
For 1,500 years or more, Christian Europe, the one supposedly existing harmoniously under this Judeo-Christian ethic of respect for individual human rights, was in fact, by Peterson's own definition, totalitarian, and dominated by tyrannical popes and kings who were doing exactly as Peterson claims Stalin, Mao, and Hitler were doing, acting as if there was no distinction between the man and the divine notion of the ideal. It is very Freudian that he conveniently ignores a huge amount of evidence that contradicts his wishful thinking of Christian monarchs being subordinate to the divine principle. This is especially troubling given Peterson's penchant for repeatedly citing the common theist delusion about Stalin's atheism or his abandonment of a Judeo-Christian ethic, which was the reason for the atrocities he committed, while simultaneously overlooking the vast number of historic examples of sickening bloodshed done by Christian rulers. A casual glance at any history book reveals a number of shining examples of not-so-Christian decency, which refute Peterson's staggeringly blinded assertion of not confusing the notion of sovereignty with the current sovereign. The Spanish Inquisition, established by Isabella and Ferdinand of Spain, Henry VIII's disregard for the yearning of his subjects to keep their heads attached to their necks, and a number of popes who used the office to line their pockets. It has only been the last quarter of the Christian era, since the Enlightenment, that monarchs who believed in their divine right of kings have been kept in check by the rule of law, starting with the execution of Charles I of England. It was the Enlightenment that established the premise of separation of church and state, which has led to the proliferation of secular humanist values in liberal democratic states, and consequently given the West only in modern times a foundation of individual sovereignty with rulers beholden to the law. The historical record shows, and this salient point appears to be lost on Peterson, that contrary to his assertions that rulers were supposed to be subordinate to God, many were most distinctly not acting out this principle. His convenient oversight of this relevant fact suggests a disingenuousness on his part, or dare I say directly, a blatant example of his intellectual dishonesty. Of course, he would simply claim those Christian examples, of which he made reference to none, but only highlights the so-called atheist states of the Soviet Union, China, and Nazi Germany, were the ones that confused the notion of sovereignty with the sovereign. But once again, he never made this point. I wonder why. Paging Dr. Freud. But Peterson thinks it's true, so that's that. As to the collapse of Judeo-Christian morality in the West and our forthcoming slide into an existential nightmare, in Peterson's own webcast with fellow Canadian psychologist Steven Pinker, he contradicts his own doomsday predictions, stating,
I noticed the same thing about 3 years ago when I was working for a UN panel on economic sustainability. For the Secretary General, the original narrative was extremely pessimistic. It detailed how we were despoiling the planet and how everything was getting worse and how we were at each other's throats. And I started to read extremely widely, and I found that on measure after measure, with some notable exceptions like oceanic overfishing, we have been doing so staggeringly much better in the last 150 years that you can't believe it on almost every measure you can imagine.
So, which is it, Jordan? A pessimistic, godless dystopia we are sinking into, or have things gotten staggeringly better? You say one thing to Pinker and another to your biblical series audience. I suspect Peterson knew Pinker would call him out on his nihilism if he tried that nonsense, so unlike his biblical lectures, for once, he opted for honesty. Further, in Enlightenment Now, Pinker refuted Peterson's pessimistic claims. Whatever the reasons, the history and geography of secularization belie the fear that in the absence of religion, societies are doomed to anomie, nihilism, and a total eclipse of all values. As for the lamentation among editorialists that the Enlightenment is a brief interlude, that epitaph is likelier to mark the resting place of neo-fascism, neo-reaction, and related backlashes of the early 21st century. If you like my content, please like and subscribe to get notified of new videos. Please also consider supporting my work by becoming a Patreon sponsor. You can also find me on the following platforms: